In the summer of 1941, the world witnessed one of the boldest military gambles of the 20th century. After sweeping through Western Europe with astonishing speed, Adolf Hitler turned his gaze to the east. His ambition was vast: the conquest of the Soviet Union, a land stretching beyond the horizon, filled with natural resources, fertile fields, and oil reserves that he believed would secure his empire forever. The invasion was given the name Operation Barbarossa, and it was designed to be swift and decisive. Hitler envisioned repeating in the East what he had achieved in France: a lightning war, a campaign of weeks, not months. The German army moved with confidence, equipped with powerful tanks, aircraft, and soldiers trained in the tactics of blitzkrieg. They pressed forward into Soviet territory with the expectation of a quick collapse. At first, the plan seemed unstoppable. Cities fell, lines of defense crumbled, and the German advance stretched deeper and deeper into Soviet lands. Yet, beneath the surface of this apparent success, cracks began to appear. The vastness of Russia, its endless fields and forests, slowed the rhythm of the campaign. The further the Germans pushed, the longer their supply lines became. Every mile gained meant another mile separating them from food, fuel, and reinforcements. The soldiers expected a short war. Many believed Moscow would fall before the autumn leaves touched the ground. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. Resistance was fierce, and each day added new losses. Still, Hitler remained convinced of victory, repeating his belief that the Soviet capital would fall before winter arrived. What the German leadership failed to consider was the power of the Russian climate. They believed the weather would not play a decisive role, that the war would be won before the first snow. But nature had its own timetable. By the time September passed into October, the armies were already facing heavy rains and muddy roads, and beyond that lay the merciless Russian winter. In their confidence, the Germans ignored history. Napoleon himself, more than a century earlier, had marched into Russia with a massive army, only to be destroyed by the same cold winds and endless distances. Hitler and his generals dismissed the lesson, convinced that modern technology and discipline would overcome the challenges of the East. Yet as the German forces advanced, the seeds of disaster were already being sown. Supply shortages grew worse. Vehicles broke down on muddy roads. Soldiers faced hunger and exhaustion. And as the days shortened and the winds turned colder, a new enemy appeared, silent, invisible, and unstoppable. That enemy was the Russian winter. It would not strike all at once, but little by little, with freezing nights, biting winds, and snow that buried roads and machines alike. For the soldiers who believed Moscow was only days away, the reality was harsh. They were walking straight into a trap set not by men, but by the land itself. Thus, the illusion of a swift victory began to fade. What started as a confident advance across the summer plains would soon become a slow struggle for survival. The German army was not only fighting the Red Army, it was marching toward a confrontation with nature, a force more ruthless than any general on the battlefield. When the German invasion of the Soviet Union began in June 1941, the soldiers marched under a blazing summer sun. Dust covered the endless roads, and the heat pressed down on men and machines alike. To the German army, the weather seemed like no obstacle at all. They expected to finish the campaign long before the seasons would change. For them, the Russian summer was simply another stage for their rapid victories. But Russia is a land of extremes, and its seasons do not wait for armies. By late August, the first rains began to fall, soft at first, then heavier and more persistent. What had been dry roads quickly turned into rivers of mud. This period, known to the Russians as Rasputitsa, marked the beginning of nature's counterattack. German tanks and trucks, designed for speed and mobility, sank deep into the sticky earth. Horses struggled to pull wagons, and supply convoys slowed to a crawl. What was meant to be a fast and decisive advance became bogged down in endless delays. September brought no relief. The rains continued, the mud deepened, and the soldiers grew weary. The blitzkrieg, lightning war, was turning into a slow and grinding march. And still, the German high command believed victory was close. They thought Moscow could be reached before the weather turned truly cold. But by October, the first signs of winter began to appear. The nights grew longer, and the air turned sharp and biting. Soldiers shivered in their thin uniforms, designed for a summer war, not for the endless winds of the Russian steppe. Their boots, once strong, cracked under the frost, and their hands stiffened while holding their weapons. For the first time, the German soldiers began to feel that the land individual was against them. Then came November, and with it, snow. At first it fell lightly, covering the mud in a thin white sheet. But soon the storms grew stronger. Roads disappeared under ice, convoys stalled, and vehicles froze in place. Food supplies became scarce, and fires for warmth were difficult to maintain. Weapons malfunctioned in the cold, lubricants hardened, rifles jammed, and tanks broke down, their engines unable to resist the freezing temperatures. For the Soviet defenders, however, the story was different. They had prepared for this season all their lives. Dressed in heavy coats and felt boots, they moved more easily through the snow. They built shelters to shield themselves from the wind and learned to fight under conditions that crippled their enemies. The winter that punished the Germans was the same winter that strengthened the Russians. By the time December approached, it was clear that the invasion had slowed to a halt. The dream of capturing Moscow before the year's end had vanished. The German army was still far from its goal, stuck in an unforgiving landscape of ice and snow. What had begun in the heat of summer had now become a battle against time, against exhaustion, and against the cold itself. The shift from blazing summer to deadly winter was not just a change in weather. It was the turning of fortune. It marked the moment when the German army, once unstoppable, began to falter under the weight of nature. The snow was no longer just snow. It was a wall, a weapon, and a warning that the war in the East would not be won in weeks or months, but through years of unimaginable struggle. By early November 1941, the first heavy snow began to fall across the Eastern Front. At first it drifted lightly, settling on trees and fields, giving the landscape an almost quiet beauty. But very soon the snow became thick, heavy, and endless. For the German soldiers, it was not a passing storm. It was the beginning of a new war, one they had never prepared for. The mighty German war machine, built for speed and precision, began to fail. Engines froze in the cold. Fuel thickened in the tanks and would not flow. Soldiers tried to light fires beneath their trucks and tanks just to bring the engines back to life. But often the machines stalled again after only a short distance. Steel cracked in the frost, wheels locked in ice, and weapons refused to fire. The snow did not simply cover the land. It buried the strength of the invading army. Supplies, already strained by long distances, collapsed under the weight of the weather. Roads disappeared under snow and ice. Trucks overturned or sank in frozen ditches. Horses, still used in large numbers by the German army, collapsed from exhaustion or froze standing in their harnesses. Food that reached the front was rock hard, impossible to eat without fire to thaw it. Bread snapped like wood. Canned meat turned to blocks of ice. For many soldiers, there was nothing to do but chew on frozen rations, while their stomachs ached from hunger. The men themselves were no better off. Their uniforms, designed for summer campaigns, offered little protection against the freezing winds. Thin coats, leather boots, and wool caps were no match for temperatures that dropped to -30 degrees at night. Fingers blackened with frostbite, toes rotted inside boots. Doctors, short of medicine, could only amputate frozen limbs. In the trenches, men huddled together for warmth, yet many did not survive the night. Meanwhile, the Soviet soldiers adapted with ease. Their weapons were simpler, built to function in the cold. Their clothing was heavier, their boots lined with felt, their coats layered with fur. They dug deep shelters into the frozen earth, lit fires, and endured conditions that destroyed their enemy. For the Red Army, winter was not a foe, but a familiar companion. For the Germans, it was a silent executioner. The first snow was more than weather. It was the signal that nature had fully entered the war. The German advance slowed to a crawl. Where once they had swept across Europe in lightning speed, now they struggled to march even a few kilometers through the blizzards. Morale collapsed. Soldiers no longer dreamed of Moscow or of glory. Their thoughts turned only to warmth, to food, and to survival. The illusion of unstoppable strength faded with each frozen machine and each broken supply line. By December, the snow was not simply falling from the sky. It was pressing down on the spirit of the German army, crushing their hopes, and reminding them that in Russia, the greatest enemy was not only the Red Army, but the winter itself. By December 1941, the German advance had slowed to a painful crawl. The once confident army that had stormed across Europe now found itself locked in a battle not only with the Red Army, but with the elements themselves. The Russian winter had arrived in full force, and with it came nights of unrelenting cold, storms of blinding snow, and winds sharp enough to cut through flesh and bone. The soldiers were caught in a storm they could not escape. Thin uniforms clung to their bodies, never meant for temperatures that dropped below -30. Boots cracked open, letting in snow and ice. Coats, light and useless, offered no defense against the freezing wind. In the long nights, men sat shivering in trenches or inside makeshift shelters, staring into dying fires, knowing that sleep could mean death. Many never woke when the morning came. The cold was an invisible weapon, striking without warning and leaving no chance for defense. Frostbite spread quickly through the ranks. Hands turned black, feet rotted, and faces froze. Doctors, working in tents whipped by icy winds, could do little more than cut away dead flesh. Each day brought more amputations, more suffering, and more men unfit to fight. Food was scarce, and what little there was had frozen solid. Canned meat became blocks of ice. Bread shattered like stone. Soldiers gnawed at frozen rations, their teeth cracking under the strain. Water was gathered by melting snow over tiny fires, but the fires were hard to maintain, and fuel was almost gone. Hunger hollowed the faces of the men, and weakness spread through the ranks. Weapons, too, failed in the storm. Rifles jammed as their oils froze. Machine guns became useless. Even the powerful German tanks could not move. Their engines froze, their tracks locked in ice, and their crews sat helpless inside shells of frozen steel. The storm had turned the mighty German war machine into silent monuments scattered across the snow. Meanwhile, the Soviet soldiers endured. Clothed in thick coats and felt boots, they knew how to survive the winter. They built shelters into the earth, lit fires, and struck quickly from the snow. The cold that crippled the Germans gave the Red Army strength. They became shadows in the blizzards, patient hunters in white camouflage, striking when the enemy was weakest. The blizzard was more than weather. It was an ally to the Soviet people and an enemy to the invaders. The Germans had not been defeated by bullets or shells, but by the silence of the frozen night. Each storm carried away their hopes. Each icy wind stripped away their strength. The soldiers who had once dreamed of glory now dreamed only of warmth. They no longer marched toward Moscow with pride. They stumbled, shaking, exhausted and broken, haunted by the cold. The Russian winter had revealed its true power. It was a weapon that could not be stopped, a weapon that needed no army to wield it. By late November 1941, the German army had reached the outskirts of Moscow. For Adolf Hitler, it seemed that the final prize was within reach. He believed that once the capital fell, the Soviet Union would collapse, and his dream of empire in the East would be secured. Yet, as the German troops struggled forward, they discovered that Moscow was no ordinary city. It was a fortress, both of stone and of spirit, defended not only by soldiers, but by an entire nation, determined to survive. The approach to Moscow was already slowed by snow and ice. Tanks, trucks, and artillery froze in place, their engines unable to resist the cold. Soldiers stumbled through drifts of snow, their thin uniforms no match for the bitter winds. Food and ammunition arrived late, if at all. The advance, once so swift, now moved only by inches. The dream of reaching the Kremlin before the new year was slipping away. Inside the city, preparations were relentless. Moscow had become a fortress. Civilians dug trenches, built barricades, and strung barbed wire across the streets. Workers labored day and night to strengthen defenses, while children and the elderly carried sandbags and supplies. It was not only the Red Army that prepared to fight, but the entire population. Every corner of the city became a position to be defended. At the same time, reinforcements arrived from Siberia. Hardened soldiers trained in sub-zero temperatures brought with them heavy winter clothing and equipment designed for the cold. These troops, fresh and ready, gave new strength to the Soviet defense. While the Germans froze in their inadequate gear, the Siberian divisions moved with confidence, their bodies and minds accustomed to the icy battlefield. The battles around Moscow were brutal and slow. German forces launched repeated assaults, but each attack faltered in the snow. Every hill, every trench, every frozen village became a strongpoint held by determined Soviet defenders. Blizzards blinded the attackers, while Soviet soldiers waited patiently, striking with rifles, machine guns, and artillery when the moment was right. The closer the Germans came, the harder the resistance grew. By early December, the German army had reached its limit. Exhausted, starving, and freezing, the soldiers could advance no further. Engines froze, weapons failed, and morale collapsed. Then, when the Germans were weakest, the Soviets launched their counteroffensive. The fresh Siberian divisions surged forward, pushing the enemy back through the snow. For the first time since the invasion began, the German army was forced to retreat. The battle for Moscow was not won by soldiers alone. It was won by the city itself, by the people who refused to surrender, and by the winter that stood as an unbreakable wall between the invaders and their goal. The snow and frost that crippled the German army gave strength to the Soviets. The cold had become a weapon, more powerful than steel or fire. Moscow did not fall. Instead, it became the turning point of the war. The German army, once thought invincible, had been stopped. The illusion of a quick victory was gone, replaced by the grim reality of a long, endless struggle. And behind this moment of defiance stood the Russian winter, silent and merciless, shaping the course of history with every storm. By January 1942, the German army on the Eastern Front was no longer the confident force that had swept through Europe. The dream of capturing Moscow had collapsed, and in its place came a grim struggle for survival. The enemy was no longer just the Soviet soldiers across the battlefield. The true enemy was within the ranks: hunger, disease, and the crushing weight of winter. The long supply lines, stretched over hundreds of miles, could not keep pace with the needs of the army. Soviet attacks cut off convoys, while snow and ice blocked the roads. Food that did reach the front was scarce, often frozen solid by the bitter cold. Bread cracked like stone when struck. Canned meat had to be thawed over small fires before it could be eaten, and when there was no firewood, men tried to bite through it as if it were iron. Rations were reduced day after day. Soldiers marched and fought on empty stomachs, their bodies growing weaker with every step. Hunger drove many to desperate measures. Horses that had once pulled wagons were slaughtered for meat. In abandoned villages, soldiers searched homes for anything edible: grain, potatoes, even animal feed. The once proud German army, known for its discipline, had been reduced to scavenging in the snow. The hunger gnawed at morale as much as at the flesh, turning strong men into hollow shells of themselves. Alongside hunger came disease. Cold and exhaustion weakened the soldiers' bodies, leaving them vulnerable to every illness. Pneumonia spread quickly in the frozen trenches. Typhus and dysentery claimed countless lives. Frostbite turned fingers and toes black, and gangrene followed. Medical supplies were almost non-existent, and the doctors at the front could do little more than cut away rotting flesh. Operations were carried out in freezing tents, with dull instruments and without proper anesthesia. Each day added more amputees, more men unable to fight, more despair. The winter nights were the worst. In the silence of the snow, the groans of the sick and the dying filled the air. Many soldiers drifted into fevered dreams, only to never wake again. Others, overwhelmed by sickness and hunger, ended their own lives with their rifles rather than continue suffering. The army was bleeding away, not through battle, but through slow decay. In contrast, the Soviet troops endured with greater resilience. Their supply lines were shorter, their clothing was warm, their boots lined with felt, their shelters built to withstand the cold. They had the support of local civilians who brought food, clothing, and aid to the soldiers defending their homeland. While the Germans starved, the Red Army grew stronger, fueled by the determination of a people fighting for survival. The silent siege of hunger and disease proved as deadly as any battle. Entire divisions were reduced to half their strength without a single shot fired. The men who had once believed they would celebrate victory in Moscow were now reduced to hoping only for bread, warmth, and medicine. The winter had closed in like a prison, surrounding the German army from within and without. The front lines were not only drawn against the Soviet Union, but against nature itself, and against the failing bodies of the soldiers who once believed themselves invincible. As the German army weakened under the weight of hunger, disease, and endless cold, the Soviet resistance grew stronger with each passing day. In the vast white landscape of the Russian winter, the Red Army and the Soviet people found both a shield and a weapon. The snow that buried the invaders became the cover beneath which resistance thrived. The Soviet soldiers moved with a confidence that their enemies could not match. They wore heavy coats lined with fur, boots thick with felt, and gloves that kept their hands steady on the trigger. Their weapons, simple and reliable, worked even in the coldest nights. From trenches dug deep into frozen earth, they launched sudden attacks, disappearing back into the snow before the Germans could respond. Snipers became symbols of fear. Hidden in white camouflage, they blended perfectly with the snow. A single shot would echo across the silence, and a German soldier would fall. The enemy never knew from where the bullet came, or when it would strike again. Each day, more German troops became victims of unseen eyes, watching from the forests, rooftops, and icy fields. Other units moved swiftly on skis, gliding across the frozen terrain where tanks and trucks could no longer go. They struck quickly at supply convoys, ambushed isolated units, and vanished into the night. For the Germans, heavy machinery and long convoys became useless against an enemy that was light, fast, and perfectly adapted to the environment. The resistance was not limited to soldiers. Civilians across the Soviet Union played their part. Villagers burned crops and destroyed food stores before letting them fall into enemy hands. Families provided shelter and food to Red Army soldiers, even when it meant hunger for themselves. Women sewed warm clothing, children carried messages through snow-covered forests, and old men armed themselves to defend their villages. The entire nation had become a fortress beneath the snow. For the German soldiers, morale collapsed further. They were hunted by shadows they could not see. The Soviets seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with precision, and vanish again. Each step forward felt dangerous. Each stretch of empty snow could hide an ambush. The winter turned the battlefield into a nightmare of uncertainty, where death could come silently from the trees, the hills, or the frozen ground. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin called on the nation to resist at any cost. His speeches echoed with determination. Moscow will not fall. Those words carried across the snowfields, filling the Red Army with resolve. The will of the Soviet people, combined with the merciless strength of winter, created a force that the Germans could not overcome. By December and January, Soviet counterattacks began to push the Germans back. Fresh divisions from Siberia, trained to fight in extreme cold, surged forward with energy and confidence. The Germans, already weakened, could not hold their ground. Villages once taken by the invaders were retaken by Soviet troops. The illusion of German invincibility was broken. The snow itself became the ally of the Soviets. It hid their movements, muffled their steps, and blinded their enemies. What had been a simple element of nature turned into a weapon as powerful as any rifle or tank. Under its cover, the Soviet resistance transformed from defense into offense, forcing the Germans into retreat. The German army had underestimated not only the Russian climate, but the spirit of the Soviet people. In the silence of the snow, that spirit revealed itself, resilient, relentless, and unwilling to surrender. And with every passing day, the winter strengthened that resistance. while the invaders continued to collapse beneath it. By February 1942, the German army on the Eastern Front was a shadow of the force that had begun the invasion only months before. What was meant to be a swift conquest had dissolved into a desperate struggle against the land, the weather, and time itself. The German soldiers no longer dreamed of victory. They dreamed only of survival, of food, of warmth, and of returning home alive. The Russian winter had proven itself not as a season, but as a weapon. It froze machines, silenced guns, and consumed men without a single shot being fired. Each day brought new casualties, not from battle, but from frostbite, starvation, and sickness. Soldiers huddled in trenches, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. Many never rose again. In the silence of the snow, entire units faded away. Tanks and trucks stood lifeless, buried in drifts of ice. Planes lay frozen on airfields, unable to take off. Rifles jammed in the cold, their parts stiff and unresponsive. The proud German war machine, which had conquered so much of Europe, now stood broken in the endless Russian winter. Meanwhile, the Red Army was growing stronger. Reinforced by fresh Siberian divisions, equipped for the cold, and supported by civilians who defended their land with everything they had, the Soviets launched counterattacks that pushed the Germans back from the gates of Moscow. For the first time since the invasion began, the German army was in retreat. The defeat was not sudden. It was slow, steady, and relentless. Each storm stripped away strength. Each frozen night took more lives. Each failed supply convoy left soldiers hungrier, weaker, and closer to collapse. The German command had planned for a war of weeks. Instead, they found themselves in a war of endurance, against a land and a climate that could not be conquered. The Soviet resistance, strengthened by the winter, turned the tide of the war. What had begun as a lightning strike across the plains of Europe ended as a stalled and broken campaign in the snows of Russia. The invincible image of the German army was shattered. The myth of blitzkrieg had been buried beneath the ice. For Hitler, the loss at Moscow marked the beginning of a long decline. The war in the East would continue for years, draining men, machines, and resources. But the chance for a quick victory was gone forever. The winter had decided the outcome. History remembers that Adolf Hitler was not defeated by Joseph Stalin alone, nor by the Red Army alone. He was defeated by Russia itself, its endless distances, its unyielding people, and above all, its merciless winter. The lesson was clear. In the vastness of the East, no conqueror can ignore the power of nature. The snow and ice, silent and patient, had become the ultimate defenders of the Soviet Union. And in that winter of 1941 to 1942, they turned the tide of the Second World War.